Hello and welcome to QT Anatomy Live. I'm your presenter, Dr. Laura Gregory. The appendicular skeleton consists of the bones and joints of the upper and lower limbs. It is therefore primarily designed for movement, where the upper limb manipulates objects in space and the lower limb provides locomotion or walking. The bones of the appendicular skeleton are shaped such that they are classified as long bones. This particular shape is important to provide the necessary leverage for muscles to move joints efficiently within the upper and lower limbs. You should also note that as we move distally, we find that there are more bones located within the upper and lower limbs. The more individual bones we have, the more complex the movements we can perform. In this online learning package on the appendicular skeleton, we will learn more about the bones within this region and the major features that contribute to the formation of important joints and major landmarks for muscle attachment. In this online learning module, we'll be looking at describing and identifying the major bony markings of the bones of the pectoral girdle, upper limb, pelvic girdle, and lower limb. We'll then identify, classify structurally, and describe the major joints of the appendicular skeleton. Firstly, let's think about what bony markings are really there for. On each bone, we'll find a number of different features, and each of these features have important roles in either to form joints and therefore are known as articular surfaces, or as a point of attachment for muscles, joint capsules or ligaments, or they could be there as just a marking for the route of nerves or blood vessels. Therefore, on the bones that we'll be looking at today, it's important to think about the purpose of each of the bony markings we'll be looking at. They may be either articular surfaces, points of attachment, or roots for a number of different structures. Let's start with the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle consists of the clavicle and the ipsilateral scapula. The pectoral girdle is important as it connects the appendicular skeleton superiorly with the axial skeleton. Here we can see the sternum of the axial skeleton articulating with the clavicle of the pectoral girdle. The term girdle refers to this ring of structures that actually surrounds or encircles a structure. So let's now look at the two bones that make up the pectoral girdle, starting with the clavicle. Try to palpate your clavicle for me now. Your clavicle is located just underneath the skin in your shoulder region. You can palpate the clavicle by starting at its medial or sternal end, which is articulating with the sternum, and then palpating more laterally to the acromial end, which articulates with the scapula. Here on this illustration, we can see that the sternal end is more bulbous and the acromial end is flattened. Let's now look at the second bone of the pectoral girdle, the scapula. In layperson terms, the scapula is known as the shoulder blade. Here we can see the scapula's position. It is located in the posterior area of the shoulder region, posterior to the ribs. On the left, we can see an anterior view, and on the right, a posterior view of the scapula. We've identified a number of features on this slide that are specifically important for joints within the appendicular skeleton. Firstly, let's look at the acromion. The acromion or acromial process is located on the lateral aspect of the scapula and is best viewed in this posterior view. The acromion, as we can see in this anterior view, has a small articular site which it articulates with the clavicle. This is the site for the acromioclavicular joint. Another important articular surface is the glenoid fossa. The glenoid fossa is a shallow pit in which the head of the humerus articulates to form the glenohumeral joint. This is an important joint as it actually articulates the scapula to the upper limb and therefore connects the pectoral girdle to the upper limb bones. Let's look internally at the glenohumeral joint in this coronal section. So orientating yourself, we're looking at the shoulder region here, the glenohumeral joint, and we've cut through the joint in a coronal or frontal plane. Inside the actual joint structure, we can look at the head of the humerus and the glenoid fossa of the scapula, which are the two articular surfaces that are contributing to the formation of the glenohumeral joint. Recall that the glenohumeral joint is a ball and socket synovial joint. You can see the ball shape of the head of the humerus fitting into this shallow concavity of the scapula. The ball and socket joint allows multi-axial movement of the shoulder and therefore a high range of motion, enabling the upper limb to manipulate objects in space. Also note the major features of a synovial joint here in this coronal section. We can see the articular or fibrous capsule, the synovial cavity itself, which is lined by the synovial membrane in pink, and there is also articular cartilage lining both the head of the humerus and the glenoid fossa. Note that the glenohumeral joint has an extra accessory feature called the glenoid labrum. This is a fibrocartilaginous ring of tissue that helps to deepen the glenoid fossa and increase the stability of the glenohumeral joint. Moving down now to the bones of the upper limb. In the arm, we find the humerus. The humerus at its proximal end has the head, which we just saw in the previous section, where we saw that the head contributes to the formation of the glenohumeral joint. Moving down to the distal end of the humerus, at the elbow joint region, we can see that there are a number of features that need to be identified. Firstly, note the lateral epicondyle and the medial epicondyle, which are two bony prominences located on the medial and lateral sides of the distal humerus. Note that these are examples of muscle attachment sites for the muscles of the forearm or antebrachium. The medial epicondyle is much larger than the lateral epicondyle. Let's have a look on our own body at the medial and lateral epicondyle. Here you can see my elbow region. Note the point of your elbow is actually part of your ulnar. The humerus is located on these two palpable aspects. On the medial side is your medial epicondyle, and on the lateral side, the lateral epicondyle. Now these two sites are muscle attachment sites, and they have the muscles of the antebrachium attaching to these points as their origin. The medial epicondyle is also known as the funny bone, and it's called the funny bone because it's this region that we often accidentally hit, which causes a tingling sensation all the way down your forearm, and particularly in the little finger. The reason why we have a tingling in the little finger and not across the whole hand is because when we hit this bony prominence, we're actually compressing the nerve that runs between the medial epicondyle and the point of the ulnar. And this is the ulnar nerve. So the compression of the ulnar nerve causes the tingling all the way down your forearm to your little finger, and that's why it actually hurts when you hit your funny bone. Let's look at a number of other features of the distal humerus. Note that the other features are both articular features, contributing to the formation of important joints of the elbow region. Firstly, let's look at the lateral side at the capitulum. The capitulum is a rounded dome-shaped structure, and it articulates with the radius. Note that the capitulum comes from the word capitate, meaning head, and it's coming from this convex shape looking like a head. On the medial side, we have this two convex structure with a dip in the middle, which is the trochlea. The trochlea comes from the word pulley, and you can hopefully see the shape of a pulley where the rope would be located in this little dip, and you've got these elevated sides on either end. The trochlea is the important articular site for the ulnar. So therefore both the capitulum and the trochlea contribute to the elbow joint structure. Let's now look at the radius and the ulnar. Focusing on the proximal side, we will find that the radius, which is located on the more lateral aspect of the forearm or antebrachium, has a head as its proximal feature. It is the head of the radius that articulates with the capitulum of the humerus to contribute to the elbow joint. On the ulnar, the proximal end has two important features that we'll look at today. The the trochlear notch, which is the articular surface, articulating with the trochlea of the humerus and contributing to the elbow joint, and the olecranon, which is actually the bony prominence of your elbow at the posterior surface of the ulnar. The olecranon is an important muscle attachment site for the triceps brachii muscle group. Let's now look at the structure of the elbow joint. The elbow is an example of a synovial hinge joint. It consists of 3 bones articulating. Here we have the distal end of the humerus and the proximal ends of the radius and ulna. Recall that it's the capitulum of the humerus articulating with the head of the radius. And then on the medial side we have the trochlea of the humerus articulating with the trochlear notch of the ulna. Therefore, when we describe the elbow joint, we refer to it having 2 specific articulating surfaces, a humeroradial joint surface and a humeroulnar joint surface, because of the 3 bones that contribute to the joint. Another joint within the elbow region is the proximal radioulnar joint. Here we can see it here. The proximal radioulnar joint occurs between the head of the radius and also the proximal end of the ulna. Note that it's in this position where a rotation movement occurs, and therefore this joint is classified as a pivot synovial joint. Let's have a look at the action within our arm. So firstly, recall we have our elbow joint. The elbow joint is actually a uniaxial joint performing the movements of flexion and extension. Now we've seen that there is another joint located in the proximal region of the radius and ulna called the proximal radioulnar joint. Now this joint allows our forearm to perform a twisting motion. So here you can see my forearm, and when I rotate it like this, such that my hand is twisting over from one side to the other, this is known as a pronation and supination movement. Pronation, palm down, supination, palm up. And this rotation movement is occurring where the radius in the lateral side of my forearm is rotating over the ulna within the medial side of my forearm. Therefore, the proximal radioulnar joint is allowing rotation of the radius around the ulna and allowing this twisting to occur of our hand. You can see that we perform this twisting action with our hand in common everyday actions. In particular, when we're twisting a doorknob or trying to take the lid off a jar, we use this pronation supination movement very naturally. Moving down to the hand, we can see the major bones that contribute to the wrist, palm and fingers. Note the distal end of the radius and the distal end of the ulna. It is specifically the distal end of the radius that articulates with this group of carpal bones to form the radiocarpal joint. The carpal bones consist of 8 small individual bones within the wrist region. We then have 5 metacarpal bones, and then we have a number of phalanges, totaling 14, that make up our fingers. Looking at the joint structures of this region, identify the radiocarpal joint, which is formed between the distal end of the radius and the proximal row of carpal bones. In this online learning package, we won't name the individual carpal bones, but make sure you review more detail according to your teaching and learning manual. Note that the ulna does not participate in the radiocarpal joint because of this articular disc, this fibrocartilaginous pad separating it from the synovial cavity of the radiocarpal joint. The radiocarpal joint is an example of a condyloid synovial joint and therefore performs the actions of flexion and extension, as well as movements in the coronal plane, including ulnar and radial deviation. Let's move now down to the more lower or inferior part of the appendicular skeleton. Firstly, the pelvic girdle. The term pelvic girdle refers to the paired ossecoxa, which are the 2 hip bones. They connect anteriorly by this joint here, which is a cartilaginous joint called the pubic symphysis, and therefore consists of fibrocartilage. Note that the term bony pelvis refers to the pelvic girdle plus the sacrum. So when we have the articulation of the sacroiliac joint between the sacrum and the ossecoxa, we now have the bony pelvis. The sacrum itself, though, is part of the axial skeleton and will be covered in the next online learning package. Therefore, we will concentrate the next slides on just the pelvic girdle, or the ossecoxa. Looking at the ossecoxa, you will note that there are three major regions which are formed due to the development of the bone itself. The more superior part is called the ilium, the posterior part is called the ischium, which is the part you sit on, and the more anterior part is called the pubis bone. Note this important articular surface, which is formed from all three of those parts of the ossecoxa, called the acetabulum, and this is the region that articulates with the femur to form the coxal joint or hip joint. Moving down to the femur. The femur is the longest bone in the body, and it can accurately estimate the stature of an individual. On the proximal end of the femur, we find the head of the femur, which articulates with the acetabulum of the ossecoxa to form the coxal joint. On the distal end of the femur, we find two round, convex points, which are the medial and lateral femoral condyles. It is these two condyles, which are articular surfaces, that articulate with the tibia to form the knee joint. Located anterior in the knee region is the patella. The patella is the largest example of a sesamoid bone within the body. The term sesamoid refers to the sesame seed shape of these sorts of bones, and the sesamoid bones are specifically located within tendons or ligaments in the body. Specifically, the patella is located in the quadriceps femoris tendon. It therefore has a very important role in reducing the friction on the quadriceps tendon, as well as increasing the leverage of the quadriceps femoris muscle during movement of extension of the knee. The tibia and fibula are important bones within the lower limb. We can see them within the leg region or crural region specifically. Note in the proximal end of the tibia, we find these two articular sites called the lateral and medial tibial plateaus. These are specifically the sites that will articulate with the lateral and medial femoral condyles to form the knee joint. The fibula does not participate in the knee joint and is located more laterally in the leg region. Let's look now at the knee joint specifically. The knee is one of the most complex joints within the body. This is because it has a high range of movement, as well as an important role in load bearing within the lower limb region. Note that the knee joint consists of actually a number of articulations, including the articulations between the femur and the tibia, known as the tibiofemoral articulations, and also the articulation between the patella and the femur, called the patellofemoral articulation. There are a number of supporting structures that actually help with the load bearing within the knee region. These are known as the ligaments and also the menisci. Let's look at these structures in more detail. Looking at an anterior view of the knee joint, we can see the articular cartilage located on the articular surfaces of the medial and lateral femoral condyles. Internally within the synovial joint cavity, we find cruciate ligaments which cross over within the cavity. The cruciate ligaments are examples of intracapsular ligaments because they are found inside the synovial capsule. Note that the anterior cruciate ligament is located on the anterior portion of the tibia, and the posterior cruciate ligament, which can be seen in this posterior view, attaches to the posterior surface of the tibia. The anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments cross over, and hence that is where their name cruciate comes from. Other important ligaments are the collateral ligaments. Here we can see the tibial collateral ligament on the medial side and the fibular collateral ligament on the lateral side. These are known as extracapsular ligaments because they are located outside of the fibrous capsule of the knee. Another important structure which is formed from fibrocartilage are the menisci. We can see the lateral meniscus and the medial meniscus in this model. Note that the lateral and medial meniscus are actually C-shaped wedges that actually help to match the shape of the femoral condyles to the tibial condyles to allow smooth movement and load bearing within the knee joint structure. The menisci are intracapsular structures. Moving down to the distal end of the crural or leg region, we find the ankle joint, which is called the talocrural joint in anatomical terminology. The term talocrural comes from the fact that it is an articulation between the talus bone, which is one of the tarsal bones, and also a combination of the fibula and the tibia, their distal ends. So the term crural is coming from the leg bones, fibula and tibia, and talo for the talus that it articulates with. The talocrural joint is an example of a synovial hinge joint and therefore moves uniaxially in flexion extension. Finally, we move to the bones of the foot, and you will note that the bones of the foot mirror the bones of the hand. Within the main ankle or foot region, we have a number of tarsal bones, 7 in total. And the largest of the tarsal bones is called the calcaneus, which forms the heel. Here is the talus we mentioned just previously, which contributes to the articulation with the fibula and tibia, and therefore is part of the talocrural joint. There are 5 metatarsals, and there are 14 phalanges within the toes of the foot. So you can see that there are similarities between the hand and the foot, and therefore we're going to review both the hand and the foot in this next section. Let's start with the hand here. Focusing in on the phalanges, you will note that there are actually 3 rows of phalanges. Note that both the metacarpals and the phalanges are numbered from the thumb side first. So therefore the bone within the thumb is known as the first phalanx. Because they're organised into 3 rows, we have a proximal row, which is closest to the wrist, we have a middle row, and we have a distal row, which is on the fingertips. The thumb only consists of 2 phalanges and therefore only has a proximal and distal phalanx. Similarly, in the foot, we number the bones from the big toe to the little toe, 1 to 5. Therefore, the first phalanx is located within the big toe. Again, just like the hand, we have 3 rows of phalanges within the foot. We have a proximal row, a middle row, and a distal row in the most extremity of the toes. Note that the big toe, just like the thumb, only consists of 2 phalanges and therefore has a proximal and distal phalanx only. Let's finish up here with the joints of the hand and the foot. The illustration has focused on the hand, as has the terminology, but it's exactly the same structural classifications for the bones within the foot. Firstly, we have a number of carpo-metacarpal joints, or tarso-metatarsal joints. These are plain synovial joints. An exception is in the hand between the thumb and the carpal bones. This is known as the first carpo-metacarpal joint. In the hand, this is a saddle synovial joint, which allows a large degree of motion. If we look at our thumb, you can see that it has a flexion-extension movement, as well as an adduction-abduction movement, and also a rotation movement and opposition. So it has a large degree of motion, multi-axial motion, and therefore is a saddle synovial joint. Also, joints we can see are the metacarpophalangeal joints, or in the foot the metatarsophalangeal joints. These are condyloid synovial joints and perform the action of flexion and extension, as well as abduction and adduction. This is possible because they're condyloid synovial joints, allowing biaxial movement, the flexion, extension, and also the abduction, adduction movement. Finally, within the fingers, we have a number of joints between the phalanges called the interphalangeal joints. Because of the number of phalanges we have the proximal interphalangeal joints and the distal interphalangeal joints. All of the interphalangeal joints are hinged synovial joints, allowing a uniaxial movement of just flexion and extension. So you can see that movement now. the flexion and extension of the interphalangeal joints of the hand. And we can do the same movement within the toes of the foot.